With 416 heavy, oversized pages, this is a colossal tome. Usually I despise unnecessarily large pages, but I think we can be a little forbearing in this case because, one, although it does tend towards too many wastefully large images and pages that have certainly not been used optimally, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's been done dishonestly. It's pleasingly free of many of the other deceptive techniques overly large books often use to give the illusion of more content than they actually include. And two, can you really produce a career pictorial on Cecil B. DeMille unless the book itself is epic? It came out in 2014 and is written by Mark Vieira and DeMille's granddaughter Cecilia with access to the extensive DeMille archives and other institutions. I get the impression that Cecilia was perhaps more of just an overseer of the project, and crediting her as co-author was more a marketing decision to get the DeMille name lending its pedigree to the book. And I say this because in the text she appears to be more of an interview subject than author, with her direct contribution seeming to be select highlighted commentary throughout. Whatever the case, I'll just refer to them both collectively as the authors. But I also wanted to mention that since you always want to keep an awareness of potential author bias, and given that it's being at least overseen by DeMille's adoring granddaughter, that's potentially going to influence how he's depicted here. So when I saw the book's subtitle was The Art of the Hollywood Epic, I didn't read into it as signifying anything specific about the book's content. I thought they're using art either in the sense of the art of cinema or just in a vague sense for a catchy title. But then I read the blurb which says, "This lavish volume opens the King Tut's tomb of cinematic treasures that is the Cecil B. DeMille archives, presenting storyboard art, concept paintings, and an array of photographic imagery." So the first two of the three types of imagery they tout are illustration art, so my interest was piqued. That then quickly developed into full-blown excitement once I started reading both of the authors' introductions describing this book. So Cecilia says, "DeMille was an art lover. He particularly loved illustration. He surrounded himself with artists and craftsmen, the best he could summon. These works of art, covering 70 films, constitute a unique collection, one of the most impressive and inspiring in existence. Most of this work has never been seen before. That, to me, is a tragedy. It should be available to all who love art and film, blah blah blah. Wanted to do a book because it meant that I could share this art, our tribute to DeMille and his artists." Okay, so this is like an actual art book made of amazing unseen works to boot. Whew. Let's read what Mark has to add. So he talks more about the text and concept of the book and how it's unique compared to what's already been published on DeMille. "We are writing this book so that other aspects of his work can be seen. Telling his story accurately has been a task of words, not images." He then highlights a couple of the best books that have already done this, and then goes on to say, "Although these authors had access to the DeMille estate, their books were not pictorials. There has never been a large format book on DeMille or the art he commissioned, the art and artifacts that have been preserved by the DeMille estate. For the first time, they can be seen in this art format book. The focus of this book is to present unseen treasures. As you go through this book, imagine that Mr. DeMille has displayed this collection in a great hall. You are walking with him and his granddaughter. One by one, they point out significant items. DeMille shares an anecdote. His granddaughter gives fuller context by recalling a story he told her. I also quote DeMille artists. The archives, the artists, and the art are showcased in a tribute to an extraordinary filmmaker." I know that was a lot to go through, but I have to do it because this is the best introduction to a book I've ever read. I've always been disappointed by how infrequent it is for authors to actually establish the concept, reason, and parameters of their book, but even rarer than that, where most books are written with a complete disregard for anything previously published, let alone actually working with them, and all try to cast such a wide net for their coverage that they just get tangled with one another and don't achieve as much as they could. But here we have intelligent, thoughtful authors who have identified an awesome, specific concept that hasn't been done before, and they've decided to put the focus on the unseen, which is also very rare. When I was reading this, I could not have been more ecstatic and honestly just proud for them, for film literature, that for all my constant lamentations that these books are almost exclusively wasted opportunities handled by inconceivably incompetent morons. But here come some peerless heroes who appear to know what's up. Too bad it turns out this was the illusion. Because once you get into the book, they whip off that mask to reveal, haha, psych, we got you. Yeah, no, we're also morons. Because the following 400 pages in no way reflect anything they just said. In fact, it is so the opposite that it is mind-shatteringly insane that they could write this intro for a book when it is unambiguously inaccurate nonsense. So let's go back through some of those comments and I'll give you an accurate description from someone who's actually read the book, since they apparently haven't. So they went on about DeMille's love of illustration and all the work he commissioned for his movies in the archives that constitutes one of the most impressive and inspiring in existence, and it being a tragedy that so much of it is all unseen, and that they wanted to do this book so they could share the art and make a tribute to the artists. So why does their giant 400-page so-called art format book only have about 60 illustrated works? They later tell us that the Ten Commandments alone generated thousands of concept works, yet the total number of artworks this book contains is less than the number of movies DeMille made. Most of them are storyboard sketches, concept paintings, and costume designs, and don't get me wrong, I'm sure most of these are unseen, and that's great. Great stuff to see, and they are the crown jewel of this book. But that's not an art book, and correct me if I'm reading it wrong, but what they describe is an art book, with the focus being on unseen works and a showcase of the art and artists. You cannot call a book with so few artworks an art book. The primary type of images featured are film stills, which are obviously not unseen, except for in the captions, the artists and their work are mentioned only a couple of times throughout, and certainly no more than any of the other filmmakers and disciplines, and far less than actors and industry stuff. So don't mistake even the paltry number of artworks in the imagery to be representative of their presence in the text, because unless you count captions telling you who the artist is, there is only a minuscule amount of information or insight about the art made for the films, or quotes from the artists or DeMille about it. This, for a book they refer to as a tribute and showcase of the art and artists. I mean, it's telling that except for 3 pieces used in the intro, the first artwork doesn't even appear until 90 pages in, despite the fact that in the intros they're clearly calling out illustrative artworks. But even if you want to broaden the idea of art to encompass all visual crafts used in creating the films, it still doesn't bear out. Props and costuming, there's only a handful of photos, and again in the text only represented to much the same degree as illustration and far less than other aspects. Set design probably fares the worst, again maybe a couple of sentences throughout, only like 4 photos of one set being constructed and no set design illustrations. Same with effects, they're rarely mentioned or seen. No images of models except for a photo of DeMille looking at one, and only one image of a miniature. As for any other artifacts or documents from the archives, it's only a couple of script pages with unreadable annotations, nothing exciting, so not exactly the promised King Tut's tomb of cinematic treasures. More like one of those other tombs that's already been looted except for some stuff they dropped on the way out. Also, speaking of the photos of the costumes and script pages, they're exclusive to this book, being photographed by Mark, who is apparently a photographer, and I say apparently because holy shadows, the lighting is atrocious. The costume photos are just amateurish, but the script pages are weirdly terrible. Like a regular person with their phone would know how to take a better picture. If this guy's calling himself a photographer, that is embarrassing. If you read this book and then go back and compare it to how they describe it in the intro, it is the most insane, delusional nonsense you can imagine. There are elements of what they mention in the book, but it is absurd to claim they characterize it or bear any significance. I am absolutely floored trying to imagine how they could write these introductions. The closest rationalization I can come to is they knew people who preview the book online can only read the first few pages, which would include their intro, so they could use that to dupe them into buying the book. But the thing that really gets me is how frustrating it is, because they're obviously smart enough to have conceived of the perfect direction for the book, one that acknowledges the existing literature and how to make a meaningful contribution to that. They laid out the plan, it was there, but then in no way followed through with it. How is that possible? That feels worse than just some total idiot who doesn't even know what they're doing from the start. And so they just shoot themselves in the foot, because had they not included that introduction, I still wouldn't have been super impressed with the book, but I would feel significantly more positive towards it without them proving they know better, setting up false expectations, and then failing to deliver on both fronts. Speaking of ultimately pointless, if we completely ignore the intro and just look at the content of the book for what it is, on the sentence-to-sentence level, the writing and quality of information are fantastic. It's what that amounts to at the chapter and book level, the bigger picture handling, that it all falls apart. Specifically because even for a book of this size, it has bitten off far, far more than it can chew. The closest thing it has to a focus is a chronological DeMille career biography, but it explores that by trying to cover him, the industry and business stuff, Hollywood history, studios, everyone he encounters, and trying to give the relevant background context for all of that, the making of his 70 movies, while trying to touch on every aspect of filmmaking throughout, trying to do it both in the big picture sense to cover it all, while also trying to color it and zoom in on specific details and anecdotes, and all this on top of having 60% of the book be for large images. It's absolutely insane. To produce a satisfactory book on the making for a single movie is barely doable. To do such a wide, general coverage of 70 movies in a 40-year career is impossible, even for books that are 100% text. For a primarily visual book to attempt to do it is pointless. And so, unsurprisingly, in spreading itself so thin, the whole book is a flashing, service-level montage. As for the nature and content of the text, it's basically a 50-50 split, with half being on the industry, studio, business stuff, history, and other background context. It's all good and interesting, but can tend towards being a generalized overview. And so while all relevant and interesting, it does eat up a lot of the word count on things not directly about making a movie, which is what the other half of the text is about, the specific making of anecdotes and information for many of the movies. But whether the movie gets a sentence, a paragraph, or 30 pages of that, all of them feel so barely touched on both visually and textually to the point that there's zero satisfaction. Because every time, just as you're getting invested, boom, it zips off to the next thing. Text about any cinematic arts and crafts feels almost non-existent except for when it occasionally pops up as a random anecdote. Pretty much every aspect of making a film gets a couple of mentions throughout the book, which sounds good, and the information and specific anecdotes are really good, but it's also so broad, shallow, random, and amounts to a couple of sentences for each area of filmmaking that it's meaningless, except for the recounting of actors' involvements in the movies and with DeMille, which, while always good relevant information, actors are given an absurdly disproportionate amount of attention, to the point that, except for the industry level stuff and DeMille himself, actors are the single largest subject area. It's far too much focus at the expense of being able to include more on people who make, actual creative contributions to the films. The only exception to all this is that after acting, writing is the discipline that gets a comparatively good and consistent showing, with pretty much every movie that gets over a page will include a decent chunk on that front. As with the filmmaking roles, the way movies themselves are represented is wildly inconsistent, to the point that it doesn't even mention, let alone cover, every one of DeMille's films, nor does everyone get an image. Granted, almost all get at least a reference in passing, but some titles don't even appear in the book, because there's not even like a complete filmography list that's included. So for all this book is done to ruin itself in trying to cover everything, it doesn't even do that right by being representative of a complete pictorial that includes all his films. But as I said, the actual content of the text written is mostly really good, even if that doesn't actually amount to a book that is meaningful or ultimately well done. It at least means that the book is still an enjoyable and interesting read. The vast majority of text is made up of quotes from a huge range of people from the movies and DeMille's career, which is awesome. The abundance and reliance on quotes, anecdotes, and solid fact-type information are particularly well used, at least until you start taking into account how much of it is regurgitation of the same stuff found in similar books. But I also really like that there's no waste on recounting plots, film analysis type crap, or really any waffling commentary or prose on the author's behalf. Having said that, there are also things in the text that should have been cut down for better use of the space, particularly that there is tons of focus on people's interpersonal relationships and interactions, and like a lot of quotes from everyone giving their general opinions / personality studies of DeMille. Obviously this is done to paint out the portrait of the main character and his interactions with people, which are often entertaining, but there is a lot of it, and when it's not revealing specific info about his career, making of a movie, or business level stuff, the lack of detail, objectivity, and space make that stuff an unwise inclusion. Even more so when it's about people other than DeMille. Overall, the book sticks very closely to him, which is good, because that's the only thing approaching any sort of focus the book has, but sometimes the text can stray either into too much of that personality study, or go on occasional tangents, always to provide relevant and interesting background context that would be fine in a book with a greater word count or smaller scope, but for a book whose eyes are already disastrously too unfocused and big for its stomach, every paragraph that is not direct, solid information about DeMille is further diluting any sense of focus, rather than using that space to solidify it. So there's this push and pull between specific recounting of the creation of the movie magic, which is where the richness is, and the discussion of the bigger picture, business side that allows that magic to happen, and it's also the connective tissue and what moves the narrative of the book along. The author has at least made a pretty good attempt of trying to balance both, but it's nonetheless futile because it all just comes back to not enough space for this unmanageable scope trying to do everything. Overall, on the microcosmic level, I appreciate how well it sticks pretty close to devoting the vast majority of the word count to content of substance and interest, but sadly that's overshadowed at the macrocosmic level since the book conceptually doesn't take that same approach, instead trying to be such a general overview that the specific content of the text is largely rendered to no avail. In the book's attempt to spin way too many plates, they all end up falling over, making the whole thing pointless, which wouldn't happen if it were focused on a single movie or subject where there are fewer plates so it's actually possible to successfully service them. The only plate it does succeed in spinning the whole time is the story of DeMille's career. That's the only thing you'll walk away with any degree of satisfaction. But even that is ultimately pointless in the scheme of things once you consider that that's already been done far better and more thoroughly in previously published works. So remember how in the introduction the author had that wonderful part where he acknowledged not only that telling DeMille's story is a task for a book of words, not pictures, but also helpfully name-dropped some books that have already done that. So they're not going to try and compete with those books and instead create something unique that focuses on the unseen and takes advantage of the art book format. Yeah, well, at this stage you probably won't be surprised that, like everything in that introduction, it's a display of rare, outstanding astuteness that's revealed to be delusional nonsense by the book not only just failing to live up to it, but actually going in the complete opposite direction. So first of all, yes, this is a predominantly visual book, but it doesn't make the most of that. About 30 to 40% of this book is text. How is that telling the story in pictures rather than words? It's an uncomfortable balance because that's a lot of space for text that could have been used to maximize its unique visual approach. But also, since the larger share is visual, that then means it can't have a word count that competes with those books that are text-focused. That's why it was such a good idea that they said they were going to leave that task to those books that have the better format for that task, while using the advantage of this book's format to do what those other books can't. So then why have they gone and not done that and put this book in a stupid, unnecessary competition it can't win against those books when they apparently knew that going in? Instead, now it's got this super uncomfortable balance where there are so many images that the text doesn't have the space to be satisfying, but also so much text that it's taking up a significant amount of space from making the most of the visuals. Meaning whether you're here for the images, text, or both, you're either not going to be satisfied or at least not getting the best experience you could. And by the way, just to be clear, I'm not necessarily saying the ratio of text to images in the book is a problem. Yes, not making the most of a pictorial is a problem, but if all the text was unique and specifically in service to those images, then that would be understandable. What isn't understandable, and is the actual problem, is that not only is this book attempting to cover the exact same territory already explored in those other books, there's also a hugely significant amount of regurgitation of the exact same stories and verbatim quotes found in other, more thorough books, which is not only annoying and pointless for both DeMille enthusiasts and the existent literature to be doubling up on so much, but also damages the book because as good as the writing and information it contains is in and of itself, the stupid futility of trying to use so much unoriginal text in a visual book to compete with books that are exclusively text-focused shoots this book in the foot, because once you compare it to existing books, it's no better quality-wise, but significantly lacking in terms of quantity, covering things far less thoroughly than other books. Despite the originality of the concept described in the introduction, instead, the reality is that conceptually this book is entirely unoriginal. Instead of telling a new story, it's retelling a story and stories that have already been told. If you're going to do that, it has to be because you're going to do it better, which this book doesn't. So even if you think that DeMille's story counts as enough focus and that that's what you're interested in, then you're better off reading one of the existing books because they've accomplished that better anyway. In case you're interested in a specific example or are just interested in a single text-focused source for information about DeMille and his movies, I recommend Empire of Dreams. It's very comparable in terms of quality, writing, and scope. Both had access to the archives. Empire of Dreams just has more coverage and more detail for many of the areas they overlap. Interestingly, for any DeMille scholars out there, I did notice a couple of minor contradictions in terms of details or how events played out in both books. I have no idea which is more reliable, but worth noting nonetheless. Even worse than the repeated text is that for all the ballyhoo about opening up the archives and focusing on showcasing the unseen, the number of images this book uses that have already appeared in other DeMille DeMille books is ridiculous. Stills, portraits, behind the scenes and candids, to the point that I actually wonder what percent of the images in here are actually unseen. Granted, there is no other DeMille book that can even come close to be worth comparing to this one on a visual level, but that's not saying much because 1, those books weren't designed to be pictorials, meaning 2, this book only wins by default due to having no other competition, but that doesn't mean it's been done well, since 3, it reuses so many images already published in those books, which is not only not what was promised, but even if it wasn't promised, still represents a stupid and disappointing waste of an opportunity and format just to pointlessly trot out so many of the same old DeMille stories, information, and photos. Now, to be fair, I don't want to give the impression that everything in here is repeated, or that it doesn't offer a significant amount of information that you can't get from Empire of Dreams or any other single or even collection of DeMille books. And just to clarify the extent of my issue with any repetition, that only extends to other books specifically on DeMille or his movies. This book also makes wonderful, extensive use of other sources too, like when it's presenting DeMille content taken from other actor and filmmaker biographies. That's fantastic. And that's previously published, not technically new, but that's not what I'm asking for. My issue is the overlap with existing DeMille books. I'm not an expert on the subject, so I can't say with accuracy exactly how much of the text and how many of these images have already appeared in previous books, but I can tell you that compared to the 3 other DeMille books I have read, the amount of overlap is at least significant enough to be a very unimpressive feature and a foolish waste of an opportunity. And so rather than producing something that makes a valuable contribution to the existing literature and complements it, instead the genuinely valuable contributions it does make to the literature are less significant than its pointless contribution to the homogeneous, overlapping mess that is all the books for fans to waste time, money, and space dealing with. Also, the big gap in my reading is DeMille's autobiography, which I'm worried would take my awareness of this book's repeated content to new heights. Now, be that as it may, for all my comments about how far more and more rewarding text can be found in other books, the most important thing you can't just discount when comparing this book to existing literature is, of course, as I mentioned, you won't find a better visual book on DeMille. Again, not because this one's impressive, but rather because there's not really any other options. But it is nonetheless very important because film is a visual medium, and that's something that's always lost in smaller, text-focused books. Like I said, pretty much all DeMille books contain some degree of imagery, but it'll be like a small color section or occasional crappy black and white photos. It's not the same as a pictorial or art book, so I don't want to undersell the visual advantage and experience being its biggest strength and difference, but the problem remains that even from that perspective, it's only winning by default, and even without any comparison to other books, just as a pictorial in its own right, its visual offerings have still been so poorly, or at least underwhelmingly, utilized that who cares if it's the best visual book on DeMille when at its core it's simply not a great visual book. As a pictorial, it hasn't done enough to justify not only its size, but more distressingly, its existence. Firstly, as I said, it does tend towards too many unnecessarily large images, meaning less images than it should have, and for a book that is supposed to be all about the visuals, is trying to cover so much and already has 30% of its space eaten up by text, it can't afford to be so inefficient on that front. Sometimes the large image size is completely justified. Many of the epic, painterly cast of thousands stills found in a DeMille movie need a canvas of this size. They're the sort of images that, reproduced any smaller, and you do start to lose magnificent visual detail. So for those images, it's great. It's the other half of the time that's the problem for images that unambiguously do not justify wasting so much space. An even bigger problem than the sizing is the absolutely lackluster curation. Obviously, we've already covered the issues with the lack of art, but even beyond that, it's mediocre at best. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes photos, and those are great, but the overwhelming type of imagery used in this book are stills and photo shoot/portrait photography, and in and of themselves, they mostly range from fine to brilliant images. The problem is they are ridiculously overused here at the expense of far more visually interesting images than the millionth portrait of an actor, and it's like, does that really represent the best images available in the archive? Is this really the best use of the opportunities this book offers? Now, many of these stills are actually from the unit photographers, meaning technically they are slightly different to the final frame in the movie, but only if you're doing a side-by-side comparison, so that doesn't count. And so as stunning as DeMille stills are, there are too many that are not the best choice of stills in addition to just overuse at the expense of better archive materials, especially when the only other visual DeMille book was The Films of Cecil B. DeMille, which is almost entirely stills from the movies, and so I suspect there's probably a lot of overlap with that one too. We already know the metaphor from the intro about this being a guided tour is garbage, but again, it just astounds me that they could describe the book that way when it's not remotely accurate, because except for the captions, there's no integral link or relevance between the images and text on the page beyond being about the same movie. And so even when arts and crafts are discussed or their creators quoted, it's random and makes up less than any of the non-visual disciplines, actors, and industry stuff. Overall, the imagery is okay and enjoyable, sure, but it's not spectacular or truly meaningful or taken advantage of to make the most rewarding visual collection. So if the artworks, costumes, behind the scenes photos and such that are here are spectacular, well, there's too few of them for that to mean much. And so, just like with the text, it's so conceptually scattered and poorly handled that on all fronts it's losing more than it gains. The whole thing just feels like a random DeMille grab bag devoid of any value, unity, or satisfaction. It's ironic that a book that physically feels like it could stop a train should, in concept and execution, be as solid as wet toilet paper, and about as important too. In being so thoughtless, stretched, and derivative, it can't achieve anything meaningful and satisfying. Is there any purpose beyond just being a bunch of random DeMille movie-related behind-the-scenes anecdotes and trivia about DeMille working on his movies? And even that shallow enjoyment diminishes depending on how much you've read previously. None of this would have been the case had they delivered on the defined, unique vision described in the intro. So ultimately, I want to be clear that I'm not saying this is a bad, uninteresting, or unenjoyable book. What I'm saying is it's silly, poorly handled, and meaningless on top of being a wasted opportunity. Big DeMille fans will obviously still want it for the good offerings it does include, even if they resent the squandered opportunity and having to buy and house a book that contains so much they already have. If you've never read a DeMille book before and just want a single overview source of his career with some nice images and have no interest in going beyond that, then yeah, just ignore the intro and you will enjoy it and get the most out of it of anyone. But one, are people with only a casual interest really buying $80 books the size of Moses' tablets? And two, even so, a more manageable scope, direction, curation, and better use of the archives would still have been more beneficial to every reader across the board, because regardless of how enjoyable or well done the book is or isn't as it stands, there is no denying it's nowhere near as good as a book that focused on sharing the magnificent artworks that still lie largely unseen in the archives. Hopefully one day someone will make an actual attempt to do that.